Good morning, guys. Welcome to our May 6th video lecture. Today, our lecture is titled America Involvement in Vietnam Comes to an End. So let's go ahead and get right on into it. A national disaster. Make no mistake, that's what Vietnam was. By Nixon's inauguration in 1969, some 30,000 Americans had already died in Vietnam. During Nixon's first year as president, 11,500 more U.S. soldiers died, and another 55,000 were wounded. By sending more U.S. soldiers home, Vietnamization drastically lowered U.S. casualties over the next 3 years. So that is one positive. Vietnamization is tested. ARVN soldiers would be granted the chance to prove that they could withstand an NVA assault without the assistance of U.S. troops in the spring of 1972. North Vietnamese troops, aided by tanks and artillery, invaded South Vietnam on March 30th, smashing through the border. With only 6,000 troops left in the country, the U.S. military provided air power to counter the northern invasion. So, next slide. Nixon expands bombing. This chart on this slide really is phenomenal to see this visualized. You can see the number of bombs dropped in World War II as compared to the number of bombs dropped during the Vietnam War. It is absolutely stunning the amount of bombs that were dropped during this war. In April, Nixon escalated the U.S. response by ordering U.S. bombers to strike North Vietnam for the first time since 1969. He also commanded the military to mine other Vietnamese ports to hopefully keep Soviet and Chinese supplies from getting into the port. Nixon achieved his goal to destroy the enemy's war-making capacity when the North's offensive was shut down by the ARVN forces. Moving on to our next slide. Peace at hand. After their country's failed invasion, North Vietnamese delegates were more cooperative at the secret Paris peace talks. That makes sense, right? I mean, they kind of go all in on this offensive. It doesn't work, so it makes sense that they would want to come back to the negotiating table. With these compromises, Henry Kissinger reached an agreement with Hanoi's diplomats. Okay, next slide. Nixon soars to re-election in a landslide. This is one of the most overwhelming political victories in U.S. history. Less than 2 weeks before the 1972 presidential election, Kissinger spoke at a news conference announcing, "We believe that peace is at hand." Polls indicated that Nixon possessed a large lead over Democratic candidate George McGovern, who was an anti-war senator. On election night, Nixon won his second term, like I said, in a landslide. I mean, just take a look at the electoral map. It is nearly a unanimous selection, right? He almost accomplished something that only George Washington has ever accomplished in our country's history. That's how wildly popular Richard Nixon was at this time. Moving on to the next slide. The Christmas bombings. Despite Kissinger's claim of having peace at hand, the fact of the matter was peace was not at hand. Frustrated by the failed talks, Nixon decided to punish the North. On December 14th, he ordered a series of B-52 and fighting bombers to attack on Hanoi on Christmas. These would forever be known as the Christmas bombings. This aerial campaign reached an intensity not previously seen in the war. As one NVA leader claimed, it was like living through a typhoon with trees crashing down and lightning transforming night into day. A truly, truly terrifying experience, I'm sure. Okay, next slide. A treaty is signed. After Nixon's assault, North Vietnam returned to the bargaining table, and South Vietnam agreed to the previous terms of the settlement. By late January, the negotiations had finalized a treaty. On January 27, 1973, representatives of the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, again a fighting wing of North Vietnam, signed the Paris Peace Accords, which established the goal of ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. Treatment of soldiers at home. The United States had withdrawn all combat forces from Vietnam by March 29, 1973. Upon arriving home, many U.S. soldiers were dismayed to find themselves the victims of their country's bitter debate over the war. When soldiers returned home from the First World War or the Second World War, they were greeted with parades. They were greeted as national heroes. When soldiers returned home from Vietnam, the reaction from citizens at home was very uneven. In maybe some small instances, you might have had parades for returning soldiers, but in many instances, soldiers were greeted from the moment they got off the plane to protest and to people yelling at them, screaming at them, throwing eggs at them, spitting on them, so on and so forth. It was a very, very sad situation for our young men to come home to. Okay, moving on, next slide. PTSD and its prevalence, particularly for combat veterans. The Vietnam War had been a harrowing experience. Many were haunted by their experiences in battle and by the death and destruction they had witnessed. They often only spoke of their combat experiences in the presence of other veterans. Of the 2.6 million Americans who served in Vietnam, nearly 500,000, so 500,000, suffered from the mental illness known as post-traumatic stress disorder. It's incredible to think that close to 20% of all of our soldiers who served in Vietnam suffered from this horrific post-traumatic stress disorder. Really just a horribly sad situation for everyone involved. Okay, next slide. POWs. More than 760 Americans were taken prisoner by the North Vietnamese over the course of the war. At least 110 of these prisoners of war, or POWs, would not survive their captivity. This is what Navy pilot James Stockdale said when he was shot down in 1965. From the moment you enter a political prison, you are told and forced to act as though you are subhuman, a dreg of society. And every effort is made to remind you daily that they're looking at you. You're not to look at the sky. That's enough to give you a left hook to the jaw. You're to bow down. You have no rights. You have no name. You have no nationality. You are a criminal. You are a worm. Imagine living through a situation like that where your captors view you in such a dehumanizing light. Unbelievable what those men must have endured. Okay. Now, North Vietnam would release all of our POWs by April 1st of 1973. Another 2,600 Americans were declared MIA, or missing in action. Some 1,800 MIAs remain lost to this day, very few of whom are thought to be alive. Okay. Next slide. The ceasefire does not last. Even though agreements had been made with North Vietnam, that didn't mean they had any intention of honoring those agreements. The ceasefire, like I said, would come to an end in 1974 when fighting erupted between the insurgents and the ARVN, killing some 50,000 ARVN soldiers. Meanwhile, North Vietnam rebuilt their army and the military apparatus in preparation for a renewed invasion of the South. Once the U.S. had left, North Vietnam began planning for a complete overhaul of the South to bring it under North Vietnamese control. So the South falls. Next slide. Early on April 30th, NVA tanks and troops entered Saigon unopposed. The video you see this week, the fall of Saigon, the helicopters on the roof of the embassy trying to get everyone out of there. They really are harrowing videos. This is what one representative said. I declare that the Saigon government, from central to local level, has been completely dissolved. The Vietnam War, as well as South Vietnam itself, had come to an end. All of our men who lost their lives, all of our men who were wounded in South Vietnam and North Vietnam, this had to be a terrible gut punch to them to think about what was lost versus what was gained. For many Americans, it felt like a very senseless endeavor. And that's why so many Americans um, at home and expats abroad felt very negative about the Vietnam War. So communism takes hold. The end of the war did not end suffering in Vietnam, make no mistake about it. Nor did it stop suffering in Cambodia or in Laos, where separate communist revolts occurred. In each of these countries, local communist insurgents took over and began to convert civilians to communism. Now, how exactly did they do that? Well, the first way they went about it were things like re education camps. They would take citizens from South Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia and put them into these harsh re education camps where you were subjected to hard labor. And it would just get worse and worse and worse and worse if you didn't submit to the communist ideals. The communists also relocated a similar number of city residents to rural economic zones to toil on collective farms. This is an idea straight from not only the Soviet Union, but from Mao's China as well. These collective farms were used on wide scale for people who didn't want to follow communist ideas. Since 1975, more than 1 million South Vietnamese have fled the country. Because many refugees left Vietnam by boat, they were known as boat people. The majority of these refugees would eventually end up right here in the United States of America. Okay, next slide. How we viewed the war. The United States was in a collective state of shock following the Vietnam War. Over 58,000 of our men died in the jungles of Vietnam, right? With another 300,000 being wounded, many sustaining severe injuries. To some Americans, these soldiers' sacrifice seemed pointless because the United States had lost the war and ultimately could have been avoided. For others, failure to win the war meant that the nation lacked the resolve to be a world leader. I don't believe that to be true. Again, I think of the Revolutionary War. Great Britain, a much mightier military power than the colonies at that time. But there is such an advantage to being able to fight in your backyard when your enemy has to come across the planet. It is so difficult to win because the enemy doesn't have to win. They simply have to not lose. So for people who look at the Vietnam War as a failed endeavor, a failure, sure, in terms of life lost, in terms of the men we lost, that is a horrific black mark on U.S. history. But Great Britain lost the Revolutionary War to 13 tiny colonies. Certain aspects of this war, that guerrilla tactic, what we used so well to create our country, was in many ways used against us in the jungles of Vietnam. Okay, moving on to our last slide for the day, the Vietnam Wall. I've actually visited this memorial with my father who fought in Vietnam, and it was an unbelievably emotional experience. He had never been to the wall, so to go and see it together was quite powerful. The Vietnam Wall, by the way, is unlike any other memorial to U.S. combat troops. Every name of every death during the Vietnam War is etched on that wall immortally. It is a harrowing, overwhelming, emotional sight when you see the wall for yourself. If you ever go to D.C., I highly recommend taking a stroll past the Vietnam Wall. Okay, so for several years after the war, Americans attempted to forget the painful memories of Vietnam, understandably so. Yet those memories sparked changes. For one, the country limited its involvement in global conflicts for a period of time. That doesn't seem like a lesson we keep with us today. We are highly involved in global conflicts around the planet. Also, because of the credibility gap fostered by government officials during the conflict, Americans' blind trust in the words of their leaders diminished. Richard Nixon has a lot to do with that, and that's going to be our topic tomorrow. A monument erected in 1982 helped many Americans, especially Vietnam veterans, and I can say this for certain because I was there with my father, come to terms with the war. I'll never forget the experience walking by that wall with my dad. It was an unbelievably emotional experience. Okay. Now, the wall, part of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., encouraged Americans to reflect on the conflict and heal some of the war's wounds. After visiting the wall, many veterans finally felt that they had come home. Okay, so that wraps up our video lecture for today. As always, stay healthy, stay well, and I miss you very much. All right, have a wonderful day. Goodbye.